It's cold out here.
Yeah, it is. It's like the South Pole.
It's like the deep South Pole, if there was one. There isn't, though.
Thanks for walking me in my door.
Yeah.
Hey everyone. Just wanted to fill you guys in on some information that I came across recently. That's some pretty wild information. That's pretty deceptive stuff that I came across here. But I was actually looking into more of this, our fantastic planet circumnavigation. And I did think that the fact that he made two different trips to the South Pole was a little strange. So I decided to do a kind of a deeper research on it and do some more investigating. And I found some pretty wildly deceptive stuff going on here. I think that it blows the lid off a whole nother angle of deception in Antarctica. Um, So we're going to get into that here in a minute, but uh, I want to add some context to this. But we can actually take measurements of the South Pole from Google Earth. We can take measurements from the 60-degree latitude and plot them out in around Antarctica. And if we're on a globe, all these measurements should be exactly the same. They're all getting plotted from the 60-degree latitude to the South Pole coordinate. So in reality, these would all have to be exactly the same. But we're going to see here that these measurements are not even close. There's mileage discrepancies of up to almost 700 miles between all these different plot coordinates. So we're going to run into that issue, and we're also going to find issues with the distances between the ceremonial South Pole, the geographical South Pole, and other South Poles that are hundreds of miles, if not thousands of miles apart from each other per Google Earth. So we're going to get in that video here shortly, and then we're also going to talk about, I found out recently that if you're going to Antarctica, whether it's for an expedition or you're going there to take pictures or you're going to research base station for scientific research, you have to fill out a NDA. So you have to sign a non-disclosure agreement anytime you're setting foot on the land of Antarctica, which, that's basically saying, hey, there's secrets here that we don't want these secrets getting out. You're going to see some stuff, you might experience some stuff that cannot be talked about outside of your expedition to Antarctica. So I thought that was very suspicious that you have to fill out a non-disclosure agreement if you decide to go to Antarctica. And we're going to get into that in a little bit here too. But first, let's get into this Google Earth video with the South Pole measurements, and then we're going to jump back into this Dick Smith circumnavigation, and we're going to point out all of the deception here. We're going to look at some of these discrepancies and problems with these South Pole measurements. Now, these measurements are coming from the 60th degree south parallel, the 60th latitude. We are not allowed to independently travel below this 60-degree latitude line per the Antarctica Treaty. This is where we're going to be taking our South Pole measurements from, is this 60-degree latitude line. So if we pull up Google Earth, we can see that this 60-degree latitude line is approximately 12,295 miles around Antarctica. Every point that we measure to the South Pole from this latitude line should be exactly the same if we're actually on a globe. So let's go ahead and check out some of these measurements. As you can see, there is quite a few major mileage discrepancies. One of them as far as 700 miles, which should be impossible on a globe. These should all be exactly the same. Maybe a mile or so off if you're not on the exact right spot, but not 700 miles. So we're going to look at some more issues here. If we measure from the South Pole to the geographic South Pole, it's about 956 miles. And then we can measure from the South Pole to the ceremonial South Pole, and it's a little over 1,000 miles. There's a distance between the ceremonial South Pole and the geographic South Pole of 131 miles. Now, why would we need to have so many different South Poles with hundreds, if not thousands, of miles between each one? Makes no sense. But we're going to actually find another major issue here, that if we look at the actual 131 mile distance from the geographical South Pole to the ceremonial South Pole, and then we look at some documentaries that document this ceremonial South Pole, we can see that the geographic South Pole is within eyesight of the ceremonial South Pole. It's only a few meters away. So how is Google Earth showing that the geographical South Pole is 131 miles away from the ceremonial South Pole, if it's literally within eyesight in this documentary? Just makes no sense. And then let's also look at where all the buildings at. I mean, I thought they were at Amundsen Scott, base station. You can't see any of the buildings with this panoramic view. And that's, you're going to see, this is going to come up later with the Dick Smith circumnavigation. There's a lot of missing scenery from some of these photos, and we're going to get in that later. But yeah, there's just a lot of very suspicious discrepancies and issues with these South Pole distances and what we're shown. So none of it's adding up, and we're actually going to get more into that here in a minute.
Speaking of Antarctica, there was another interesting thing I found, that when you apply to go down there for whatever reason, take pictures, to go work as a scientist or whatever, you have to sign a non-disclosure agreement. If you guys know what that's like, it's like somebody's giving you secrets about a certain product or a new TV show, and you're not allowed to say anything. So what's going on down in Antarctica that you might see while you're down there that you're not allowed to say anything, besides Sir Richard Fakes-A-Lot faking another expedition?
So I was doing some more research on this Dick Smith circumnavigation, and I kind of thought, the two trips that he made to the South Pole seemed a little odd. So I decided to do a little bit of deeper research and kind of investigate that a little bit. So let's go ahead and get into it here. I did find some pretty wild information that was pretty interesting, and very suspicious, and incredibly deceptive. I think that it, kind of blows the lid off a whole nother angle of deception in Antarctica. But let's go ahead and get into that here. So this was his first trip to the South Pole. We can see there's the Scientific Research Center dome here, and there's this little building over here. We can see that he's, obviously at Amundsen Scott South Pole Station here. We can also notice these signs, wood signs here, that are staked into the ground here by these flags. So, this is basically his first trip there. Now, we're going to kind of take a look at his other second trip to the South Pole and kind of compare the difference here. So this was his second trip, and obviously we notice there's no flags here, but it's because he's on the other side of the South Pole. So if he's on the other side, he would be pointing this way. He would be looking over here. He would see this dome. He'd also probably see he would see the Amundsen Scott Station here, which is a pretty large building. You would see that in front of him, which is probably about another couple hundred feet this way. So you notice that. You would also notice these wood signs staked in the ground by these flags. So I looked here and I noticed that there's this reflective sphere. So that is reflecting what he's actually looking at. So I decided to kind of zoom in a little bit. And I noticed that there is nothing behind these flags. There's no scientific dome. There's no Amundsen Scott Station. And these wood stakes that we were talking about earlier, that would be right here with these flags, those would, those would be standing out. You would see this kind of distorted blur here between these flags. You would see a bunch of these wood stakes over here, these signs, either here or you'd see them here. So a lot of stuff is missing here from what he should be seeing, right? So that's the first major thing I noticed. Well, I decided to look into it a little bit more, and I kind of read into what he was doing at the South Pole, and I noticed there is something specific that he brought up that was incredibly interesting. So upon going to the South Pole the second time, there he was claiming that the Americans at the South Pole would not help him with any supplies or refueling. What they say? But we have to have it because the Americans won't help us with the supplies here. So his first South Pole station, he was refueling up. There's photos of him refueling his airplane. He's eating dinner with the people at the base station. Everything's going great. Everybody's getting along. And then all of a sudden, he's there a second time and he's like their worst enemy. Like they don't want anything to do with him, no contact. They don't want to refuel his plane. They don't want to give him supplies. They don't want him to stop at the station and hang out. Like, what is going on here? Why is there no Americans? Where he's at this second trip. Well, then I got thinking it's because he's not at the same South Pole station. He's at another completely different, arbitrarily located South Pole station. That's why there's no Americans there to help him. It doesn't even make sense. Like if he's right there at the South Pole station, they would at least let him refuel his plane and stop in to get something to eat and help him out. Didn't want anything to do with him. Didn't want to give him any supplies. So obviously he's not at the station there. Well, then I started doing some more looking here. And I thought, okay, well, if the imagery isn't matching up, what else isn't matching up here? And one thing I noticed is the actual South Pole itself looked drastically different than from the first trip to the second trip. And I looked and I'm like, well, this top, obviously he's looking at the opposite side here, because the flags are on this side. But you first look here at the top, this would be painted down to here. You would see, because you can see here, it's painted down here. It'd be 6-7 inches lower. That stripe would be right here. You would notice that it's missing. And then you also notice the bottom strip. And I actually took a closer picture here, compare the two. So here is his first trip. Here's the second trip. Look at the paint here is missing. From this should be over here on this side. This would be much farther down. So I noticed that, but then look at the bottom. Like the South Pole, like this is like an inch above the ground. And then here it's about 7 or 8 inches up above the ground. And this is just, coming back a few days later. The pole is completely different. Now, sure, you could say they, maybe they dug the pole out and put it back in the ground, which is highly unlikely and doesn't make any sense. Or, it could have snowed a little bit. There might have been a blizzard and it snowed a bit and the snow is a little bit higher on the ground. But if you look, the snow is all packed down. Like it's not not like soft snow that just came from a blizzard. It's all been packed down and walked around, and even then, it's 7 or 8 inches difference here. This bottom stripe, this is much lower into the ground than this one. And then even if that was the case, if there was more snow, it wouldn't change the fact that the top is totally different. This stripe is not even close to the same here. This is two different poles at two different South Pole locations. So now you have no scenery shown in the image from the second trip to the South Pole. None of that imagery is in there. None of those wood signs are in there by these flags. The South Poles themselves are completely different. And the Americans won't even, like, they're not even there. So it becomes very obvious that he's at an entirely different location. Now, if you remember the video we showed earlier with the Google Earth showing all these stations hundreds, if not thousands of miles away from each other, there's multiple South Poles that are, completely, in different locations from each other, but then we're told in a documentary that they're right next to each other. So there's just all this deception going on here with these different South Poles. Obviously here you can see he's at two different locations. It just doesn't add up. So I got to thinking, okay, well, what's going on here? And I looked at this map, and he could be leaving Casey Station and going this way. And here's the other thing too, is you notice that there's never any South Pole expeditions from any of the Australian bases. So if you're in Australia and you want to take a South Pole expedition, you're here, you can't just go to the South Pole to like Casey or Mawson Station that are 2,000 miles from you, and then just go to the, make an expedition to the South Pole. You have to fly all the way down to South America, 7,000, 8,000 miles out of the way, and then fly down here, and then go on your South Pole expedition. And I can give you an example of this. There was a couple Australians that had made a expedition to the South Pole from Australia, and they did not go to the South Pole from Casey Station. They actually flew to South America, and from South America they went to the Antarctica Peninsula, and they then went to the South Pole for their South Pole expedition. So we can see here, they went from South America then to the Antarctica Peninsula, and then down to the South Pole. So it just, why not just go the extra 2,000 miles from Australia to Casey Station and take the shorter route, as opposed to flying an additional 7,000-8,000 miles out of the way to go all the way down to South America to make an expedition to the South Pole? Like, it makes no sense. So it would make a lot more sense for them just to go the shortest route to Antarctica. So I don't know, something just didn't add up with this expedition here. And not only that, but like, if they had some kind of tourism infrastructure set up, they could, Australia could rake in billions of dollars from, these Indonesian islands and India and Asia. All these countries would be going to, Australia to go to these South Pole expeditions. It never happens. It doesn't exist. Everybody in the world has to go to South America to go to the geographical South Pole. So that's just another, a whole nother topic, but it's just, you start to look into the Australia thing. The only tourism that they have for Antarctica and Australia is this little short flyover that they have from New Zealand to Australia. There's a little couple 100-mile patch of Antarctica that they just skim over and they fly back to Australia. That's it. You can't go to Casey Station, can't make an expedition to the South Pole from there. Everything has to be done in South America and then flying down to Antarctica, which again makes no sense. So it just adds to the pile of discrepancies of Antarctica and these South Poles. We know that there's and several different South Poles, and there might even be more that we don't even know about. If you're at one of the Russian stations or the Australian stations and you're on the other side of the world, if they say, okay, this is the path, you got to go to the South Pole, you're going to go there. You're not going to know that you're actually, going to this South Pole or that spot South Pole. They're just going to tell you this is the arbitrary location you have to go to, because obviously they're not going to want you traveling the extra 15 to 20,000 miles around the whole coastline just to actually get to the geographical South Pole. So they could be placing these all over Antarctica. But, I'm kind of glad that I looked into this circumnavigation and looked into these South Pole expeditions, because it's very obvious there's this alone shows that there's two different South Poles that he went to, which that in itself is pretty telling of a lot of these expeditions to Antarctica. So, and this, it kind of almost in a way validates the vast size of Antarctica. Like if it truly was a small ice continent at the bottom of the globe, there would just be the one South Pole, and then there would be a ceremonial South Pole, and they would be right next to each other. And you could be in Australia or Russia, and you could make a South Pole expedition to that South Pole. There wouldn't be several different South Poles that are thousands of miles apart from each other, and everybody in the world wouldn't have to fly to South America to take a South Pole expedition. So to me, it shows more of the deception in Antarctica. To me, it just shows that there's who knows how many different South Poles. I mean, this one expedition alone, I mean, it's got 4 strikes against it. It's got strike 1. There's the scenery is not shown in the background of this sphere. So strike 2, the poles don't match. It's it's not even close to the same South Pole. It's a different pole. Strike 3, there's no Americans there to even help him out, because he's not even at that station. The Americans are on the other side of the world at Amundsen Scott Station. And they know strike 4, there's documentation on Google Earth that there's all these other stations that are thousands of miles apart from each other. So it all starts to point to there being multiple stations that are set up that way with the infrastructure of Antarctica. So I just thought that was incredibly interesting information. It just kind of blew the lid off this whole thing. So really wanted to point that out as I do more research in Antarctica. But yeah, some pretty wild stuff that I discovered here. So I just wanted to pass that along to you guys and show you some more of the deception going on in Antarctica.
So that was pretty much my 2 cents on this Dick Smith expedition. Someone told me to check it out, so I figured I would take a minute of my time to look into it. I don't think that it is what we're told it is, just from the mileage and time frame discrepancies, the tens of thousands of miles of undocumented exploring, the tons of missing information, the incredibly suspicious multiple trips to apparently 2 completely different South Poles, and no log for any of the many refueling stops during the expedition. I also think that with all the modern advancements in technology and GPS tracking, that at least one person would have done at least a similar expedition as this one. If this was so easily accomplished over 30 years ago, why has not a single person flew over the South Pole from the other opposite side Australian side of Antarctica ever since. And even the handful of recent explorers who have attempted to circumnavigate north to south over the last decade, we have been able to debunk and we're able to objectively prove that they didn't circumnavigate the globe just by simply observing their flight coordinates. If this guy from over 30 years ago could allegedly accomplish this, then there should be hundreds of people since then that have done this by now. But yet we've had only maybe 7 or 8 attempts at this north to south circumnavigation over the span of 50 years, and they were all debunked and failed to circumnavigate the globe. And then you have this one expedition in question from over 30 years ago that spent over 4 weeks to fly over the South Pole of Antarctica, that had tens of thousands of extra miles, undocumented exploring, just tons of missing information. You know, these 2 suspicious trips to 2 different South Poles, you know, and no log for the many different refueling stops during the expedition. I think that in itself is pretty telling to the legitimacy of this expedition. It seems a bit similar to the Sir Ranulph Fiennes and Transglobe expeditions, and we all know how much of a lie both of those were. And I'm just going to leave it at that.